shadow of the crown. Imagine a world where a single word from a king can erase an entire civilization. Behind the shimmering gold of the Persian Empire and the fragrant gardens of Susa, a deadly game of chess is being played. At its center is an orphan girl with a secret that could get her killed, a powerful official with a heart full of ancient hate and a decree of death that cannot be undone. This isn't just a story of royalty and banquets, it's a high-stakes psychological thriller where beauty is a mask, silence is a weapon, and one woman must decide if she's willing to die to save a nation. Is it luck or is it destiny? Let's step inside the palace walls and discover the incredible story of the Book of Esther, the grandeur of Susa, and the rise of a hidden queen. Close your eyes and imagine a world of unparalleled opulence. It is the 5th century before the Common Era. We are in Susa, the winter capital of the vast Persian Empire, a superpower that stretches from the sun-drenched Indus Valley to the ancient mountains of Ethiopia. This is the realm of King Xerxes, a man whose wealth is as boundless as his ego. The story begins not with a prayer, but with a party. A celebration that lasts 6 months, showcasing the riches of the kingdom. The palace floors are paved with porphyry, marble, mother of pearl, and precious stones. The air is thick with the scent of roasted meats and expensive wine served in vessels of pure gold. Xerxes wants the world to know one thing: he is the center of the universe. But as the final 7-day feast reaches its climax, a crack appears in the facade of his absolute power. On the 7th day, fueled by wine and vanity, the king commands his queen, Vashti, to appear before the assembly of drunken nobles to show off her beauty. It was an act of profound disrespect, treating a queen as a mere ornament. And in a move that shocked the foundations of the empire, Vashti says no. The silence that followed her refusal must have been deafening. In an instant, the king's pride is wounded. His advisors, fearing that Vashti's defiance would spark a revolution of independence among all the women in the empire, urge the king to take drastic action. Vashti is banished, stripped of her crown, and disappeared from the pages of history. Now, the king is alone, his anger cooled, but his throne empty. A decree goes out across the 127 provinces. Find the most beautiful young women in the land and bring them to the harem in Susa. It is a state-sponsored beauty pageant, but with terrifying stakes. In the heart of Susa lived a man named Mordecai, a descendant of the tribe of Benjamin, part of the Jewish diaspora living in exile. He had a cousin named Hadassah, known to the world as Esther. She was an orphan, raised by Mordecai as his own daughter. Esther possessed a beauty that was more than skin deep. She had a quiet strength, a grace and favor that seemed to follow her like a shadow. When the king's officers came knocking, Esther was swept away into the palace. Mordecai, knowing the precarious position of Jews in the empire, gave her one strict command: do not reveal your people or your family. And so Hadassah became Esther, a girl with a hidden identity living in the heart of a pagan empire. For 12 months, Esther underwent a rigorous regimen of perfumes and oils, but she remained grounded. While other women clamored for the finest jewelry and silks to impress the king, Esther took only what the eunuch in charge suggested. She wasn't trying to perform, she was simply being herself. When she finally stood before Xerxes, the king didn't just see a beautiful face, he saw something he had never encountered in his court of sycophants. He loved Esther more than all the other women. He set the royal crown upon her head. In a grand coronation, Esther became the Queen of Persia. But even as the bells rang and the feasts began anew, she carried a secret that could end her life. She walked the halls of the palace as a queen, while her heart remained with her people. Outside the palace gates, Mordecai sat daily, watching over his cousin from a distance. One afternoon, while sitting at the king's gate, he overheard a whispered plot. Two of the king's guards, Bigthana and Teresh, were conspiring to assassinate Xerxes. Mordecai didn't hesitate. He got word to Esther, and Esther informed the king, giving credit to Mordecai. The plot was thwarted, The conspirators were executed, and the event was recorded in the official court records. At the time, Mordecai received no reward, no gold, no promotion, no thank you. He simply went back to his seat at the gate. It seemed like a forgotten detail, a minor footnote in the history of the empire. But in the grand design of this story, there are no coincidences. The stage was set. A Jewish girl sat on the throne, a loyal man sat at the gate, and in the shadows, a great evil was about to rise. The shadow of Haman and the decree of death. The peace of the palace was not destined to last. As the seasons turned in Susa, a new figure emerged from the corridors of power, a man whose name would become synonymous with malice. His name was Haman, the son of Hammedatha, an Agagite. To the casual observer, he was merely a high-ranking official promoted by King Xerxes to a position above all other nobles. But to those who knew the ancient scrolls, the title Agagite carried a dark and bloody history. Haman was a descendant of the Amalekites, the ancestral enemies of the Jewish people. This was not just a political promotion, it was the awakening of an ancient feud. King Xerxes, perhaps seeking to solidify his administration, issued a royal command. All the royal officials at the king's gate were to kneel and pay honor to Haman. It was a display of absolute subservience. Whenever Haman walked through the gates, the air would fill with the sound of rustling robes as men hit the dust in reverence. But there was one man who remained standing, one man whose knees would not bend: Mordecai. Day after day, Haman would stride past, his head held high, basking in the forced adoration of the masses. And day after day, his eyes would snag on the solitary figure of Mordecai, standing tall and silent. The officials at the gate whispered to Mordecai, "Why do you disobey the king's command?" They knew the danger. They knew that in the Persian Empire, a whim of a superior could mean the end of a life. But Mordecai's response was simple and unshakable. He was a Jew. His conscience, bound by a higher law, forbade him from giving divine-like honor to a man, especially a man from a line that had long sought the destruction of his people. When Haman realized that Mordecai was not just being stubborn, but was acting out of a deep-seated religious conviction, his irritation turned into a white-hot, poisonous rage. To Haman, it wasn't enough to simply punish Mordecai. To kill one man would be too small a satisfaction for an ego as vast as his. He decided that the only way to truly avenge this perceived insult was to wipe out Mordecai's entire heritage. He would not just strike the man, he would pull the entire Jewish race out by its roots. But Haman was a man who believed in fate as much as he believed in his own power. He called for his diviners to cast the lot to determine the most auspicious time to execute his genocidal plan. Month after month was tested by the roll of the dice, until the lot finally fell on the 13th day of the 12th month, the month of Adar. Haman smiled. He believed the gods had spoken. He believed he had nearly a year to prepare the perfect trap. Armed with what he thought was divine approval, Haman approached King Xerxes. He did not lead with his personal hatred. Instead, he used the classic language of the manipulator. He framed his prejudice as a matter of national security. "There is a certain people," Haman told the king, "scattered and dispersed among the peoples in all the provinces of your kingdom. Their customs are different from those of all other people, and they do not obey the king's laws. It is not in the king's best interest to tolerate them." It was a brilliant, albeit evil, pitch. He painted the Jews as the other, the outsiders who were a threat to the unity and stability of the empire. Then he added the sweetener. He promised to pay 10,000 talents of silver into the royal treasury to cover the costs of the operation. This was a staggering sum, likely a significant portion of the empire's annual revenue. He was essentially offering to buy the right to commit genocide. Xerxes, a king who often preferred the comforts of his harem to the tedious details of governance, didn't even ask for the name of the people. He took the signet ring from his finger, the very symbol of his irrevocable authority, and handed it to Haman. "Keep the money," the king said, "and do with the people as you please." With that one careless gesture, the fate of millions was sealed over a casual conversation. The royal scribes were summoned immediately. Under Haman's direction, they drafted a decree in the name of King Xerxes. It was translated into every language and written in every script of the 127 provinces, from India to Ethiopia. The language was chillingly precise: destroy, kill, and annihilate all the Jews, young and old, women and children, on a single day, the 13th day of the 12th month, the month of Adar, and to plunder their goods. The couriers, spurred by the king's command, went out in haste. As the decree was posted in the city of Susa and sent out on horseback to the far reaches of the empire, the atmosphere changed. A dark cloud descended over the land. The Bible records a haunting contrast. The king and Haman sat down to drink, but the city of Susa was bewildered. Imagine the scene in the Jewish quarters. Families gathered for dinner, only to hear the shouting of the heralds in the street. Fathers reading the parchment with trembling hands, realizing that their children were now marked for death by the highest law in the land. There was no court of appeal. There was no hiding place. The law of the Medes and Persians could not be repealed. When Mordecai learned of everything that had been done, he tore his clothes, put on sackcloth and ashes, and went out into the city, wailing loudly and bitterly. He was a man crushed by the weight of a catastrophe he had inadvertently sparked. All across the empire, in every province where the edict reached, there was great mourning among the Jews, with fasting, weeping, and wailing. The hidden people were now in the direct crosshairs of a superpower. In the palace, Esther sat in her ivory tower, shielded from the news. But her maids and eunuchs came to her, distressed, and told her about Mordecai's public display of grief. She didn't know about the decree yet. She only knew that the man who had been a father to her was in agony. She sent him clean clothes, urging him to take off the sackcloth, but he refused. Finally, Esther sent her trusted eunuch, Hathach, to find out what was troubling Mordecai. Mordecai gave Hathach a copy of the decree to show Esther and told him everything, including the exact amount of money Haman had promised to the treasury. His message to the queen was clear: go into the king's presence to beg for mercy and plead with him for your people. The message hit Esther like a physical blow. She sent word back to Mordecai, reminding him of the law that everyone in the empire knew. Any man or woman who approaches the king in the inner court without being summoned, the king has but one law: that they be put to death unless the king extends the gold scepter. And then she added a heartbreaking detail: and I have not been summoned to come to the king for 30 days. She was a queen, yes, but she was a queen at the mercy of a volatile man who had already banished one wife for a single act of disobedience. To go to him was a suicide mission. The shadow of Haman's decree had now reached the very throne room, and the girl who had spent her life hiding her identity was being asked to step into the light and face a certain death. The tension was at a breaking point. The villain was celebrating, the king was indifferent, and the hero was terrified. For such a time as this, the queen's gambit. The message Esther sent back to Mordecai was one of cold, hard reality. She wasn't being a coward, she was being a pragmatist. In the Persian court, the king's word was law, and his temper was a fire that could consume anyone. But Mordecai's response to her hesitation was not one of sympathy. It was a wake-up call that would resonate through the centuries, a challenge that stripped away the comforts of her royal status and forced her to look at the naked truth of her existence. Mordecai sent back these words: do not think in your heart that because you are in the king's house, you alone of all the Jews will escape. For if you remain completely silent at this time, relief and deliverance will arise for the Jews from another place, but you and your father's house will perish. Yet who knows whether you have come to the kingdom for such a time as this? These words hit Esther with the force of a tidal wave. Mordecai was telling her that her position as queen was not a stroke of luck or a reward for her beauty. It was a strategic placement by a higher power. He was telling her that silence was not a safety net, it was a death sentence. If she stayed quiet, she would die anyway when her identity was eventually discovered. But she would die having failed her purpose. But if she spoke, she might die, but she might also be the instrument of a miracle. For an American audience, this is the ultimate moment of truth. It's the scene in the movie where the protagonist realizes that their whole life has been leading up to one singular, terrifying choice. Esther stopped being a passive participant in her own life. She stopped being the orphan girl who did what she was told. She became a leader. She sent a final message to Mordecai, and this time she was the one giving the orders. "Go," she said, "gather all the Jews who are present in Susa, and fast for me, neither eat nor drink for 3 days, night or day. My maids and I will fast likewise. And so I will go to the king, which is against the law. And if I perish, I perish. If I perish, I perish." In those 5 words, Esther found a courage that was deeper than physical bravery. It was a total surrender to destiny. For 3 days, the Jewish community of Susa went silent. No cooking fires were lit. No wine was poured. There was only the heavy, expectant silence of a people waiting on the edge of an abyss. Inside the palace, Esther was not just skipping meals. She was stripping away her reliance on her own charm and throwing herself at the mercy of the divine. On the 3rd day, the time for waiting was over. Esther dressed herself in her finest royal robes. She didn't dress like a victim, she dressed like a queen. She put on the crown, the silks, and the jewels of her office, but beneath the finery, her heart was pounding against her ribs like a trapped bird. She walked through the labyrinthine corridors of the palace, each step echoing on the polished stone. She reached the entrance to the inner court, the place where no one went uninvited. She stepped into the doorway. At the far end of the hall, seated on his massive throne of gold and ivory, was King Xerxes. The air in the room felt heavy, charged with the power of life and death. The guards stood like statues, their spears glinting. Xerxes looked up. He saw a woman standing where no one was allowed to stand. The law demanded her execution. The silence in the room was absolute, a breath-holding moment that felt like an eternity. Then the king did the unthinkable. He reached out and extended the golden scepter toward her. Esther moved forward, her legs feeling like lead, and touched the tip of the scepter. She was safe, for now. Xerxes, perhaps moved by her bravery, or perhaps simply captivated by her presence after 30 days of absence, asked, "What is it, Queen Esther? What is your request?" "Even up to half the kingdom, it shall be given to you." This was the moment. She could have blurted out the truth. She could have fallen at his feet and told him about Haman's evil plot right then and there. But Esther was playing a much deeper game. She knew Xerxes and she knew Haman. She knew that a direct accusation in the middle of the court might backfire. She needed to get the king and the villain alone, in a setting where she held the power of hospitality. "If it pleases the king," she said softly, "let the king and Haman come today to a banquet I have prepared for him." Xerxes, intrigued by the mystery and always ready for a feast, agreed immediately. "Bring Haman quickly," he commanded. At the first banquet, the wine flowed and the food was exquisite. Xerxes asked her again, "What is your petition?" But Esther felt the timing wasn't right. She was weaving a web, and the fly wasn't quite centered yet. She asked them to come to a second banquet the following day. She was building anticipation, making herself indispensable to the king's evening and making Haman feel like he was the most important man in the empire. Haman left that first banquet walking on air. He was delirious with pride. He was the only person invited to a private dinner with the king and queen. He felt invincible, but as he walked out through the king's gate, his joy hit a brick wall. There stood Mordecai, and once again Mordecai did not bow. He didn't even flinch. Haman's ego, which had been inflated to the size of the palace, popped. He went home in a rage. He called his wife Zeresh and all his friends together to brag about his wealth and his special invitation from the queen. But then he spat out the poison. "All this gives me no satisfaction as long as I see that Jew Mordecai sitting at the king's gate." His wife, a woman as cold-hearted as her husband, gave him a suggestion that was as tall as it was cruel. "Have a gallows built 75 feet high," she said, "and in the morning ask the king to have Mordecai hanged on it. Then go with the king to the banquet. and enjoy yourself." Haman loved the idea. The height of the gallows, 75 feet, wasn't just for execution, it was for a public spectacle. He wanted the whole city to see the body of the man who wouldn't bow. He ordered the construction to begin immediately. Through the night, the sound of hammers and saws echoed through the streets of Susa as the architect of destruction built a monument to his own hatred. As the sun began to set on that fateful day, the pieces of the board were in place. Esther was praying, Mordecai was waiting, and Haman was building a gallows, unaware that he was constructing the very instrument of his own undoing. The queen had made her move, and the king was intrigued, but the night was about to take a turn that no one, not even the queen, could have planned. The night of sleeplessness and the great reversal. The third night of this saga did not begin with a banquet or a decree, but with a simple human infirmity. The king could not sleep. In the grand tapestry of the Book of Esther, this is perhaps the most profound moment of all, the invisible hand moving in the silence of a restless night. Xerxes, the master of 127 provinces, the man who could command armies with a nod, found himself defeated by his own racing thoughts. To pass the long dark hours before dawn, the king gave a command that seemed mundane. "Bring the book of the records, the chronicles, and read them to me." He didn't ask for music, or for his wives, or for wine. He asked for history. And so, in the flickering light of oil lamps, a scribe began to read the dry, administrative logs of the empire. Hour after hour, the monotonous voice of the scribe droned on, recounting tax records and border disputes. But then, the scribe reached a specific entry from years prior. He read the account of how Mordecai the Jew had discovered a plot by two of the king's chamberlains to assassinate him. He read how Mordecai had reported the threat, saving the king's life. The king sat up. The fog of his insomnia cleared. "What honor or recognition has been shown to Mordecai for this?" he asked. The attendants looked through the records, checked the ledgers, and whispered among themselves. Their answer was a cold silence. Nothing has been done for him. In the world of the Persian court, this was a grave oversight. To leave a life-saving debt unpaid was a sign of weakness in a king. At that exact moment, just as the first grey light of dawn began to touch the palace walls, a footstep echoed in the outer court. "Who is in the court?" the king asked. It was Haman. He had arrived at the palace at this ungodly hour, driven by his own brand of insomnia, the insomnia of hatred. He couldn't wait for the business day to begin. He was there to ask the king's permission to hang Mordecai on the 75-foot gallows he had just finished building. He was at the peak of his power, certain that his request would be granted with a wave of the king's hand. Before Haman could utter a single word about gallows or execution, Xerxes spoke. "Haman, what should be done for the man the king delights to honor?" Haman's heart leapt. His ego, already swollen to the point of bursting, blinded him. "Who would the king delight to honor more than me?" he thought. He saw this as the crowning moment of his career. He decided to ask for the impossible, to taste what it felt like to be the king himself. "For the man the king delights to honor," Haman began, his voice thick with ambition, "let them bring a royal robe the king has worn and a horse the king has ridden, one with a royal crest placed on its head. Then let the robe and the horse be entrusted to one of the king's most noble princes. Let them robe the man the king delights to honor and lead him on the horse through the city streets, proclaiming before him, 'This is what is done for the man the king delights to honor.'" It was a bold, narcissistic request. Haman wanted to be seen as the king's equal. He stood there, likely imagining the feel of the royal silk against his skin and the cheers of the crowd. Then came the hammer blow. "Go at once," the king commanded. "Get the robe and the horse, and do just as you have suggested for Mordecai the Jew, who sits at the king's gate. Do not neglect anything you have recommended." Imagine the silence that followed. The blood must have drained from Haman's face. The man he had come to kill was the man he was now ordered to crown. The man he loathed was the man he had to serve. In a moment of supreme divine irony, Haman was forced to go to the king's gate, not with a death warrant, but with a royal robe. The scene that followed is one of the most vivid in ancient literature. Haman, the second most powerful man in the world, was forced to act as a stable boy for his mortal enemy. He had to dress Mordecai in the king's own clothes. He had to help Mordecai onto the king's own horse. And then Haman had to walk on foot, leading the horse through the crowded streets of Susa, shouting until his throat was raw. This is what is done for the man the king delights to honor. The crowds watched in stunned confusion. They saw the man who had signed the decree of death being honored by the man who had written it. The power dynamic of the empire had shifted in a single morning. When the parade was over, Mordecai did something remarkable. He simply went back to his post at the gate. He didn't gloat, he didn't boast. He returned to his place of service and waiting. But Haman rushed home, his head covered in shame, wailing in agony. He gathered his wife and his advisors, the same people who had encouraged him to build the gallows. But the atmosphere had changed. The arrogance was gone, replaced by a chilling realization. His wise men and his wife Zeresh said to him, "Since Mordecai, before whom your downfall has started, is of Jewish origin, you cannot stand against him. You will surely come to ruin." Haman had no time to process this prophecy of doom. Even as they were speaking, the king's eunuchs arrived at his door. The second banquet was starting. The queen was waiting. The trap was set. And Haman, the man who thought he was the hunter, was about to realize he was the prey. The sun was high in the sky, and the final curtain was about to rise on the grandest reversal in history, the triumph of justice and the legacy of Purim. The atmosphere at the second banquet was worlds apart from the first. Haman sat at the table, but he was a broken man, a shell of the arrogant official who had walked these halls just 24 hours earlier. The humiliation of parading Mordecai through the streets still burned in his chest, and the prophecy of his wife that he would surely fall echoed in his ears like a funeral knell. Across from him sat Queen Esther, poised and radiant, but with a fire in her eyes that Haman was too blinded by his own misery to recognize. And between them sat King Xerxes, a man of action who was growing impatient for the truth. As the wine was poured, the king leaned toward Esther, his voice echoing in the private chambers. "Queen Esther, what is your petition? It shall be granted you. And what is your request? Even to half of my kingdom, it shall be done." This was the moment of no return. The time for which she was born had finally arrived. Esther didn't lead with a political argument or a theological lecture. She spoke to the king's heart, and she spoke as a woman whose life was hanging by a thread. "If I have found favor in your sight, O king," she began, her voice steady despite the storm inside her, "and if it pleases the king, let my life be given me at my petition, and my people at my request. For we have been sold, I and my people, to be destroyed, to be killed, and to be annihilated." The king's eyes widened. He was a man of power, but even he was stunned. Someone had dared to threaten his queen. Someone had tricked him into signing away the life of the woman he loved. "Who is he?" Xerxes demanded, his voice rising in a thunderous roar that shook the golden vessels on the table. "Where is the man who has dared to do such a thing?" Esther didn't hesitate. She didn't point to a distant enemy or an abstract law. She leveled her gaze directly at the man sitting across from her. "The adversary and enemy," she said, "is this wicked Haman." The silence that followed was like the air before a lightning strike. Haman froze. The realization hit him with the force of a physical blow. The queen was a Jew. The people he had marked for slaughter were her people. His secret genocide had become a personal assault on the throne. Terrified, Haman looked at the king, but he saw only a mask of murderous fury. Xerxes, overwhelmed by a mixture of betrayal and rage, stormed out into the palace garden to catch his breath and decide how to deal with this unprecedented treason. In his absence, Haman did something that sealed his fate. In a desperate, pathetic attempt to beg for his life, he fell onto the couch where Esther was reclining. At that exact moment, the king stepped back into the room. To his eyes, it didn't look like a plea for mercy. It looked like an assault. Will he even molest the queen while she is with me in the house?" Xerxes bellowed. The guards immediately rushed forward and covered Haman's face, a sign that he was already a dead man walking. Then one of the king's eunuchs, Harbona, spoke up, pointing out a detail the king hadn't yet noticed. "Look," he said, "a gallows 75 feet high stands by Haman's house. He had it made for Mordecai, who spoke up to help the king." The king's command was short, sharp, and final. Hang him on it. And so, in a twist of poetic justice that has resonated through history, Haman was executed on the very instrument of death he had designed for his enemy. The man who had sought to be the highest in the land found himself suspended high above it, a grim monument to the consequences of pride and hatred. But the story doesn't end with the death of the villain. The decree Haman had written, the law that ordered the annihilation of the Jews on the 13th day of Adar, was still in effect. Under the law of the Medes and Persians, a royal edict sealed with the king's ring could not be revoked, not even by the king himself. The Jewish people were still scheduled to die. Xerxes took the signet ring he had reclaimed from Haman and handed it to Mordecai, who was now promoted to Haman's position. He gave Esther the estate of Haman as a gift, but Esther fell at the king's feet again, weeping, pleading for the lives of her people. Since the original decree couldn't be cancelled, Mordecai and Esther devised a brilliant legal counter-strategy. They issued a new decree, written in the king's name and sent by the fastest horses to every corner of the empire. This new law didn't cancel the first, but it gave the Jews the legal right to assemble and protect themselves, to destroy, kill, and annihilate any armed force of any people or province that might attack them. When this new decree reached the provinces, the atmosphere of mourning vanished, replaced by light and gladness, joy and honor. The Jewish people were no longer sheep led to the slaughter. They were a community empowered to fight for their survival. On the fateful 13th day of Adar, the enemies of the Jews rose up to carry out the first decree. But they found a people prepared and a government that now favored them. Instead of a massacre, it was a victory. The Jews defended themselves with such strength and unity that their enemies were defeated across the empire. In Susa, the 10 sons of Haman were also executed, ensuring that the lineage of the oppressor would not rise again. The following day, the 14th of Adar, became a day of rest and celebration. Mordecai recorded these events and sent letters to all the Jews, near and far, establishing an annual festival called Purim, named after the pur, the lot that Haman had cast. Purim was to be a time of feasting and joy, of sending gifts of food to one another and giving to the poor. It was a day to remember that what was intended for evil had been turned to good. It was a day to celebrate the girl who became a queen, the man who wouldn't bow, and the invisible hand of providence that guides history, even when its name is not spoken. The Book of Esther ends with Mordecai the Jew ranking second only to King Xerxes, powerful and held in high esteem by his fellow Jews, because he worked for the good of his people and spoke for the welfare of all. For the American listener, the story of Esther is more than an ancient chronicle. It is a testament to the power of the individual to change the course of history. It reminds us that courage is not the absence of fear, but the realization that something else is more important than fear. It tells us that justice may be delayed, but it will not be denied. And most importantly, it challenges every one of us to look at our own lives, our own positions, and our own opportunities, and ask that haunting, eternal question: who knows whether you have come to your position for such a time as this? The story of Esther is unique in the Bible because it's the only book where the name of God is never explicitly mentioned. But as we've seen, his fingerprints are on every page in the timing of a king's restless night, the courage of a hidden queen, and the sudden reversal of a villain's plot. Personally, I find this incredibly powerful. It tells us that even when life feels chaotic, even when it seems like the bad guys are winning, there is a grander design moving beneath the surface. You are not where you are by accident. Like Esther, you might be exactly where you need to be for such a time as this. Thank you so much for journeying through the halls of Susa with us today. If this story touched you or gave you a new perspective, please hit the like button and share this video with someone who needs a reminder of courage today. Don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you won't miss our next deep dive into the most incredible stories ever told. We'd love to hear from you. Leave a comment below with your favorite part of Esther's journey, or tell us which book of the Bible you'd like us to explore next. Your feedback helps us grow and continue creating these stories for you. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next chapter.